Morning. As we continue through the story, we're now into week 9. Can you believe it? We're moving right along. I'm so glad that you're here today to share with us as we go through this. You know what? This week I was trying to think of a way to kind of convey a good start to the message, and so I was just thinking. Back a few years ago, I saw this video of this boy who was opening up his Christmas gift at Christmas time. And of course, you know, it's Christmas morning. He's real excited, and he's tearing into the gift, and he opens it up. And when he opens it up, it's a box. And on the box, it's got this picture of a pottery wheel, and it says pottery, you know, it says some company's name, and it says it's a pottery wheel. And he looks at it, and he's kind of got like this look of like disappointment. He's like, "This is what you got me for Christmas? I got a pottery wheel." You know, this is like a 10-year-old boy, and he doesn't want a pottery wheel. So, you know, he's kind of, when you watch the video, he kind of goes through like all of these different sets of emotions within a few seconds, right? So at first when he opens it and he sees this box, he's he's disappointed. You know, you can just see the sadness in his face. He's like, This is what I'm getting for Christmas, is a pottery wheel. And then he almost has like this hurt look on his face, right? Like, I can't believe out of all the gifts you got me, this is what you got me. And, you know, he's just really hurt, and he's really despondent. And then, you know, when people go through, there's these stages of grief. Well, he's kind of going through the stages of grief with this gift, because he finally gets angry, all right? So he gets the gift, and he's holding the box, and he gets the gift, and he just throws the gift across the room, and he goes storming out all mad, all right? So when I was thinking about this, I see this video, and I'm thinking, wow, what disappointment that this young guy was going through, right? When he opened the gift and it wasn't quite exactly what he was wanting. You know, as adults, I think we all tend to deal with disappointment in our own kinds of ways, don't we? I mean, as we've gotten older, there's been different things in our life, different people in our life that has disappointed us. And, you know, and I would hope that as we got older, that maybe we don't throw things across the room, maybe like this young kid did. But we all know the feeling, right? We all know the feeling of what it means to be disappointed. And you know, some people just, sometimes we just disappoint people. I know that with my wife, I've disappointed my wife many times. I have to say, I'm coming into the time of year in my life where I sweat a little bit, okay? All right? And the reason why is because her birthday is in like a week and a half, okay? And so I'm thinking in my head, okay, what am I going to do for her birthday? What am I going to do for her for Christmas? And you know what my biggest fear is that I'm going to disappoint her, because I'm really bad at buying gifts. All right, I'll admit it. I'm really bad at it. My wife will tell you that, and I very willingly, she's taken things back because it's been that bad. Okay, it's been bad. All right. So I'm worried about the disappointment thing, okay? We all worry about disappointment. We all worry about those things in our life that bring disappointment. And as we grow older, we get better at hiding our disappointment. And sometimes we just swallow our disappointment. And even when it really, really, really hurts, we swallow it and we try to hide it. And the problem is that when we swallow our disappointment, what happens? Well, it turns into bitterness. I mean, the more and more we go through life and we swallow our disappointment, it becomes bitterness. And perhaps you've experienced this in your life. Maybe you're going through a period in your life right now where there's a lot of disappointment. You know, perhaps you've gone through all of the things in your life, and things have happened to you and you're disappointed. I mean, maybe there's someone here today, maybe there's someone who's went to college and they've gotten their degree, right? And they try to find a job and they can't find one for their degree. And maybe they have to move back in and live with their mom or their dad. I know my family went through this a little bit back right after we first got married. We were building a house. We thought it'd be ready by the time we had to move out of our rental. Well, then the lady tells us we have to move out. So we have to go back and move in with my mom and dad, with Matthew and Hannah, who were only about 2 and 3 years old. That was a very disappointing time in my life. I didn't think that that's where I would be. And maybe for some of you too, maybe the disappointment in your life that you bring with you today is a marriage. Maybe in your marriage, you've had a lot of anticipation. You had all this anticipation for your wedding day, but here it is a few years later. Maybe it's been 2 or 3 years later, or maybe it's 20 years later, and there's a little bit of disappointment in your life at how things have turned out. Maybe you've we've all got our stories of disappointment, don't we? I mean, we've all got them, and I think we're going to see one today. We're going to be in the book of Ruth today. We're going to start off right there in the very, very first chapter. I hope you had a chance to read it. It was chapter 9 in the storybook today, and I hope you had a chance to read through that this week because we're going to see a story about disappointment. Now, I want to just say this before we really get into this book today. When you first come into contact with the book of Ruth, you kind of wonder a little bit, okay, what's this book doing here? I mean, if you were to take a really big look at the entire Bible, and then you come to the book of Ruth. Remember last week we talked about the judges. We come to the book of Ruth, and it's kind of like, why is this here? And the reason why we might wonder that is that the book of Ruth took place during the time of the judges, but it's not about the judges. It's about Israelites, although we will see that Ruth was a Moabite, but it's not about Israel as a whole. It's kind of a very personal story, and so it seems kind of strange that it would fit in here. But God in His wisdom and in writing this book, this Bible that we have, I think He knew that we needed a book to see how we can handle disappointment in our life. And so that's what I want us to look at today. Now, as we get into it, as we look at this story, we realize that this story is about a guy named Elimelech, and it starts off with his wife Naomi. Now, Naomi was a woman whose name meant pleasant or sweet. So she was a very pleasant and sweet woman. People liked being around her. They enjoyed her. It really did capture her life. So she's married, and she's got 2 sons, kind of the typical family, right? Things seem to be going really well, and things are just, they're sweet, right? They're really good. Well, that's where we pick up our story today, because we read in the book of Ruth that the story goes a little bit awry. We realize that in Israel at the time of Ruth, or at the time of Naomi and Elimelech, is that we realize that there's a famine in the nation, and that the famine has become so severe, it's become so bad, that they have to move to find food. They have to migrate somewhere else to try to find food. Now, for us in a country where we have grocery stores down the street and where we can go into a dispenser and with a cup and push a button in and drink comes out into a cup, it's kind of hard for us to imagine what it's like to have nothing, right? Well, that's where these people were. And so I was kind of thinking, okay, how would I compare this to today? How would I compare it to today? How could we bring that into our own situation? Well, I think it would be a little bit like this. It would be like a husband who comes home from work one day, and you could tell he's pretty upset. He doesn't say anything. He's quiet. He goes and sits down in his chair, and he turns on the TV, and he looks at the screen, but you could tell he's not paying attention to it, but he doesn't want to say anything. And so when he goes to lay down at night with his wife, he tells her that he has lost his job. Okay? So he tells her he's lost his job, and so of course she tries to comfort him, tries to make him feel better, but the problem is that 6 months later things are still bad. He hasn't been able to find a job. He hasn't been able to find any way of bringing in any income, and so things are really bad. And so they start selling things in their home to try to buy things, to pay the bills, to buy food, and so 2 years later it's still bad. He still can't find a job. They have absolutely nothing. They've lost almost everything. As a matter of fact, the entire community now has lost their job. I think this might start giving us a little bit of an idea of what it was like for them. Now, you might start thinking when you first read this story, you think, well, yeah, I can understand why I would move. People move all the time, right? I mean, when you lose a job or you look for a new job, you move somewhere else. What's unusual about that? But what was different about this was that they were moving out of complete and utter desperation. I mean, can you imagine every day waking up and seeing your kids starving, hungry, crying for food, seeing them lose weight, seeing yourself lose weight, your wife? That's the situation that they were in. And so they decided that they had to move in order to survive. And so this is the place where Naomi and her husband are at. And so what do? They go looking for food, and they go to a place called Moab. Now, we're going to throw up here on the screen. Here's a map. You could see here, up here where it says Bethlehem, Judah. You see it up there, right under Jerusalem? So they moved from Bethlehem, Judah, down to Moab. Okay, so it wasn't too far away. It was probably about a 40 or 50 mile distance to get down to Moab. Not too far, but they were leaving behind everything they had ever known. to go there to try to find food for their family. Now, here's the other side of this. See, you have to realize that Elimelech had been given land. He had inherited land from his family. So not only are they leaving the land, but they're leaving land that they had inherited. You know, today, in a relatively speaking, it's somewhat easy for people to buy and purchase and sell land. Back then, it was much more difficult because land was something you generally inherited. It was something you passed down. So here Elimelech is having to leave with his family, leave this land that he had been given to try to find food for his family. And so they left a part of who they were behind to go to this new place. So they go to Moab, and they end up in Moab, and I just want you to know, Moab was not a good place. Moab was a place filled with false religion and false gods. It was a very pagan culture, and as a matter of fact, the Moabites were sworn enemies of Israel. They did not like Israel. They went to war with Israel on occasion. But because Naomi and Elimelech were so desperate to eat for their family and for themselves, they went to this land because Moab had remained fertile during this time. So, imagine this. They're getting ready to go to a very unfriendly land. But I can imagine Naomi. You know, like we said, the Bible says that she was sweet, she was nice. And so she's getting ready to go to this place, and she thinks, yes, things are bad, but you know what? I have my family, and I have God, and so we can make it. I mean, actually, when you look there in the book of Ruth, it says that when she left to go to Moab, that she felt full. She felt full when she left to go to Moab. In other words, not full in her stomach, but just full in her heart. She was happy that she had her family. This is a lady with a wonderful disposition. But something else happens. You think things gotten bad already. So they get to Moab, and things are starting to get a little bit better. There's a little bit more food available. And then her husband, Elimelech, gets sick. And not only does he get sick, but he dies. So now, Naomi is a single mom in a hostile country. Okay, she's lost her husband, and she's a single mom in a hostile country. Time goes along, though, and her two sons grow up, and they meet two Moabite women. And they get married to them, and their names are Orpah, and that introduces us to the namesake of our book that we're reading today, Ruth. Orpah and Ruth are the two daughter-in-laws that these two sons meet, and they get married, and so things are looking better, right? Her two sons are married, they're going to have families, but guess what? Following the two weddings are very quickly two funerals as both of her sons die. Okay, so let me get this straight. She has to leave her homeland, the land that they've inherited. Her husband dies. She raises these children only to see them die. And so now it's just her and these two daughters-in-law. Can you imagine the disappointment in her life? Can you imagine the grief in her life, the hurt in her life? Do you think she had a lot of questions for God? You bet she did. I can't imagine the grief that she was going through. Edgar Jackson, he kind of defines grief as this. We have it up here on the screen. Grief is a silent, knife-like terror and sadness that comes 100 times a day when you start to speak to someone that is no longer there. Grief is the emptiness that comes when you eat alone after eating with another for many years. Grief is teaching yourself to go to bed without saying goodnight to the one who has died. Grief is the helpless wishing that things were different when you know they are not and they never will be again. That is where Naomi was at. And most of us have been there before. And maybe we're there right now, aren't we? You know, we've all lost someone in our life that we desperately loved, that we dearly loved. And you know what? And if you haven't, you will. Death finds a way of impacting all of us at some point in our life. None of us are going to be exempt. And so that's where Naomi's at. Naomi is in this deep sense of grief and pain. So you know what she decides to do? She decides to go back to Israel. Things are maybe a little bit better, and so she goes back to Israel, maybe to be better there. And so she tells Ruth and Orpah, she says, hey, you guys stay behind here in Moab, meet a new guy, get married, have a family. I'll be okay. I'll be all right. Well, Orpah decides to stay there in Moab, but we find out that Ruth, her other daughter-in-law, says, I'm going to go with you. I want to go with you. And so in Ruth chapter 1, verse 16, Ruth says to her mother-in-law Naomi, she says, don't urge me to, to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you and me. That's some powerful language, isn't it? That she was going to go with her mother-in-law back to Israel. Now, you know what? When I was looking at this, something that kind of funny and interesting kind of come across to me. You know, this text is sometimes used at weddings. I've heard this used at weddings by the bride and groom, you know, to say that I will be with you till you die and all that. But really, the context is different, because it wasn't really between a husband. It wasn't really between a husband and a wife that this was said. It was between a mother-in-law and a daughter-in-law, right? Okay? So the text is shared. So if we take this into context, if we were to do this in the wedding, all right, what this would mean would mean that the bride would have to turn around from her spouse during the ceremony and look at her mother-in-law and say, I will go where you go, and I will... I don't think this is going to catch on in a wedding ceremony, do you? So if we took it into context, that would probably be what it is. But nonetheless, I don't think that's a tradition that's going to catch on. But that is exactly what's happening here. That is exactly what's happening here, is that Ruth is showing love to Naomi and will go with her. I mean, the Bible says that when Naomi realized that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped urging her. In other words, she stopped trying to tell her not to come with her. And so Ruth and Naomi, they take this dangerous journey, two women taking this journey back, and they go to a place that you've heard of before, and that place is, and I've already mentioned it, is Bethlehem. We've heard that name before, haven't we? They go back to Bethlehem. Now, at this time, Bethlehem was a town of about 200 people, not a very big town. And when Naomi arrives into town, people kind of recognize her, but she doesn't look like the same old Naomi. She's not the happy, cheerful person that she was when she left. In Ruth chapter 1, it says, Naomi says this, "The Almighty has made my life very bitter. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. The Lord has afflicted me. The Almighty has brought misfortune upon me." Can you imagine that? She's angry. She's mad at God. You know what? Her story wasn't supposed to go this way, was it? This isn't the way her story was supposed to be. Does that sound familiar? Is that your story? Is that your life? Have you ever wondered why your life isn't working out quite the way that you thought it would? Maybe you wonder, what is my story all about? What is this really all about? You know, when you read this story of Ruth, if you were to read through the first chapter or so, you might think that this story is about loss, right? I mean, you look at everything that Naomi has lost. She's lost everything. But my question about this book today, my question for you in your life is, does your story, does your life, does it have to be about loss? Does your story have to be about loss? Maybe you have focused so much in your life on what you've lost. You know, Gerald Sitzer, who was a professor, we have a picture here of him. He's a professor at Whitworth College out in Spokane, Washington. A number of years ago, he was in a car accident, and he was hit by a drunk driver in a minivan. And during this accident, he lost 3 generations of his family. His mother died, his wife died, and he lost his youngest daughter. But he himself wasn't hurt. And in an interview some time back, he talked about what that was like. And he's actually written a book about going through the journey, and I like the name of the book. It's called A Grace Disguised. And here's what he says about loss. He says, the experience of loss does not need to be the defining moment of our story. Now, it's one thing for me to say that. It's something else, though, right, when someone like this says that. And he goes on to say, the defining moment can be our response to the loss. The story doesn't have to be about the loss. The story could be about our response to the loss. In other words, the thing is with life, and this is something you need to realize right now. You have to realize this right now, is that, you know what? You don't get to decide what roles that you play in the story of your life. You don't get to decide those roles, but there is something that you get to decide. It's what are you going to do with that role? You get to choose that. What is your attitude going to be about that? So you have a choice to make with your loss. Will it define me, or will my story be different? I mean, it's hard, isn't it? And that's where Naomi is at. It really is hard to not get caught up in the pain of the lower story. And that's where many of us are. But here's what you need to see. I think it's this. If you need to sum up Naomi's story, as we look here in the book of Ruth, I don't think the story is about loss. This story is about redemption. If there's one word to sum up Naomi's story, it's about redemption. And so you might be wondering, well, what in the world am I talking about? Well, there's more to the story. Okay, there's more to it than this. So at this time, we're going to do something a little bit differently today. I've got a few people who are going to come up, and we're going to read a lengthy text together. And I've got several different parts. If you could come up, and we're going to read through the text. We're also going to have it on the screen so you can kind of somewhat follow along. It's not exactly word for word, but you can follow it along. And I want you to listen to this story. I know some of you are more like audible listeners. You listen more to speaking, so maybe you just close your eyes and listen. Maybe you can just read along with the text. But we're going to read the story, and there's four main characters. I'm going to be the narrator, and we've got Scott that's going to be Boaz. We've got Christy here who's going to be Ruth, and Mary's going to be Naomi. And so as they read, just kind of listen to how the story goes and how it turns from loss into redemption. All right, so here we go. Starting in chapter 2, verse 1, it says, "Now Naomi had a relative on her husband's side of the family named Boaz, and he was a wealthy, prominent man from the clan of Elimelech. And one day Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi,
'Let me go to the fields so I can gather grain behind whoever permits me to do so.'
'You may go, my daughter.'
So Ruth went and gathered grain in the fields behind the harvesters. Now, she just happened to end up in the portion of the field belonging to Boaz, who was from the clan of Elimelech. Now, at that very moment, Boaz arrived from Bethlehem and greeted the harvesters.
'May the Lord be with you.'
And they replied, 'May the Lord bless you.' So Boaz asked his servant in charge of the harvesters,
'To whom does this young woman belong?'
The servant in charge of the harvesters replied, 'She is the young Moabite woman who came back with Naomi from the region of Moab. She asked me, may I follow the harvesters and gather grain among the bundles? And since she has arrived, she has been working hard from morning until now.' And so Boaz said to Ruth,
'Listen, my dear, do not leave to gather grain in another field. You need not go beyond the limits of this field. You can go along beside my female workers. Take note of the field where the men are harvesting, and follow behind them with the female workers. I will tell the men to leave you alone, and you, when you're thirsty, you may go and get water from and drink as some of the servants have drawn.'
So Ruth knelt before him and with her forehead to the ground said to him,
'Why are you so kind and attentive to me, even though I am a foreigner?'
And Boaz replied,
'I have been given a full report of all that you have done for your mother-in-law following the death of your husband, how you left your father and your mother as well as your homeland and came here to live among the people that you did not know previously. May the Lord reward your efforts. May your acts of kindness be repaid fully by the Lord God of Israel, for whom you have sought protection.'
'You really are being kind to me, sir, for you have reassured and encouraged me, your servant, even though I am not one of your servants.'
So later, during the mealtime, Boaz said to her,
'Come here, have some food. Dip your bread in the vinegar.'
So she sat down beside the harvesters, and then he handed her some roasted grain. And she ate all she wanted and she saved the rest. Or roasted grain she ate until she was full, and she saved the rest. So when she got up to gather grain, Boaz told his male servants,
'Let her gather grain, even among the bundles. Don't chase her off, but make sure that you pull out ears of grain for her and drop them so that she can gather them up. Don't tell her not to do so.'
So she gathered grain in the field until evening, and when she threshed what she had gathered, it came to be about 30 pounds of barley. She carried it back to town, and her mother-in-law saw how much grain she had gathered, and then Ruth gave her the roasted grain she had saved from mealtime, and her mother-in-law asked her,
"Where did you gather grain today? Where did you work? May the one who took notice of you be rewarded."
So Ruth told her mother-in-law with whom she had worked, and she said,
The name of the man with whom I work today is Boaz.
and Naomi said to her daughter-in-law,
"May he be rewarded by the Lord because he has shown loyalty to the living on behalf of the dead. This man is a close relative of ours. He is our guardian."
So Ruth the Moabite replied,
He even told me, You may go along beside my servants until they have finished gathering all my harvest.
"It is good, my daughter, that you should go out to work with his female servants. That way you will not be harmed, which could happen to you in another field."
So Ruth worked beside Boaz's female servants, gathering grain until the end of the barley harvest as well as the wheat harvest. And after that she stayed home with her mother-in-law. And at that time Naomi, her mother-in-law, said to her,
"My daughter, I must find a home for you so that you will be secure. Now Boaz, with whose female servants you worked, is our close relative. Look, tonight he is winnowing barley at the threshing floor. So bathe yourself, rub on some perfumed oil, and get dressed up. Then go to the threshing floor, but don't let the man know you are there until he finishes his meal. When he gets ready to go to sleep, take careful notice of the place where he lies down. Then go, uncover his feet, and lie down. He will tell you what you should do."
I will do everything you have told me to do.
So she went down to the threshing floor and did everything her mother-in-law had instructed her to do. And in the middle of the night, Boaz was startled and turned over. He saw a woman lying beside him, and he said,
Who are you?
I am Ruth, your servant. Marry your servant, for you are a guardian of our family interests.
May you be rewarded by the Lord, my dear. Don't worry, I intend to do everything that you propose. For everyone in the village knows what you are a worthy woman. Now, yes, it is true that I am your guardian, but there is another guardian who is a closer relative than I am. Remain here tonight. Then in the morning, if he agrees to marry you, fine. Let him do so. But if he does not want to do so, I promise, as surely as the Lord lives, I will marry you. Sleep here until morning.
So when Ruth returned to her mother-in-law, Naomi asked,
"How did things turn out for you, my daughter?"
and Ruth told her about all the man had done for her, and she said,
He gave me these 60 pounds of barley, for he said to me, Do not go to your mother-in-law empty-handed.
"Stay put, my daughter, until you know how the matter turns out, for the man will not rest until he has taken care of the matter today."
Now Boaz went up to the village gate and sat there, and then along came the guardian whom Boaz had mentioned to Ruth. And Boaz said,
Come here, sit down, friend.
So he came and sat down, and Boaz chose 10 of the village leaders, and they sat down. And then Boaz said to the guardian,
Naomi, who has returned from the region of Moab, is selling a portion of the land that belongs to our relative Elimelech. So I am legally informing you, acquire it before those sitting here and before the leaders of my people. If you want to exercise the right to redeem it, then do so. But if not, then tell me so that I may know. For you possess the first option to redeem it, and I am next in line after you.
And the man replied, I will redeem it.
Now, when you acquire the field from Naomi, you must also acquire Ruth, the Moabite, the wife of our deceased relative, in order to preserve his family name by raising up a descendant who will inherit this property.
But the guardian said, Then I am unable to redeem it, for I would ruin my own inheritance in that case. You may exercise my redemption option, for I am unable to do so. And then Boaz said to the leaders and all the people,
You are my witnesses today that I have acquired from Naomi all that belongs to Elimelech, Chilion, and Mahlon. I also acquire Ruth the Moabite, the wife of Mahlon, as the wife to raise up a descendant and who will inherit this portion, for the name of the deceased might not disappear from among his relatives and from this village. You are my witnesses today.
So Boaz married Ruth, and the Lord enabled them to conceive, and she gave birth to a son. And then Naomi took the child and laid him in her lap and cared for him, and the women living there said, Naomi has a son. Now listen to this, everybody. They named him Obed, and he was the father of Jesse, who was the father of David. Okay, thank you all very much. So, Naomi thinks she's coming back empty-handed. She thinks that God has abandoned her. But you know what? If she would just stop and wipe away the tears from her eyes, she would see that God is at work, isn't He? God is at work redeeming her story. And so the question is, how does God redeem this story? Well, first thing is this. First thing is He redeems her story of loss with an unlikely friendship. You know, God does this, doesn't He? Whenever we grieve, He brings along people to help us get the strength to make it through. And the funny thing is, it's not often the person that you would think it would be. Sometimes He'll just send people that maybe were a peripheral friend, someone, an acquaintance, and they come into your life and they become a deeper friend in the midst of your loss. And in this case for Ruth, it was a daughter-in-law from Moab. So first of all, it was a daughter-in-law, and secondly, it was from a nation in which, well, they didn't like each other, the Israelites and the Moabites. You know, the Bible tells us that Ruth loved Naomi so much that the townspeople say in Ruth 4:15 that Naomi was better than 7 sons. Okay, which that's saying something, because a son was pretty much your future as a woman in that time. She was better than 7 sons. Now, if you remember, though, if we go back a little bit with this story, if you remember, at first, Naomi tried to push Ruth away, didn't she? She was trying to say, oh, you need to stay back in Moab. You need to stay back here. You know what? That's something we often do as well in our grief, don't we? In our own grief, we often try to push people away. But we need, instead of pushing people away in our grief, my encouragement to you is to allow people in. Don't fall into the temptation to isolate yourself. I've seen this, and I've seen what it can do. But there's something else too here we need to know. See, the thing is when we grieve and when we are fearful, the thing is when we're in the middle of all that, we need to allow someone close to us, because we just want to know that everything is going to be okay. Right? Isn't that why we want someone near us? You know, through the years with my kids, this has happened. It's sometimes we'll get on a ride and we'll be halfway through it and they'll be like, I wish I hadn't done this. And they just grab my arm and I just say, it'll be okay. You'll be all right. Back a couple of years ago when my son Josiah, when he broke his arm, you know, you could just see the look of fear in his eyes. And over again, his mom and I, we would just say to him, it's going to be okay. That's what we want in the midst of our grief, in the midst of our pain, in the midst of our hurt. And you know what? Isn't that what the church should be? I mean, as we go through life and we run into the problems that come with life, when we run into the disappointments and the grief and the hurt, isn't the church supposed to come alongside us in life? And aren't we supposed to grab each other by the arm and tell one another, it's going to be okay? Isn't that what we're about? Isn't that what we should be about? And that's what Naomi needed. But there's something else too. We also see that God redeems loss through undeserved kindness. And in this case, the story that we just read was about Boaz, right? Now, I'm sure when you listen to some of this story today, you thought, man, there's some weird stuff in there, right? I mean, that's some weird stuff. This whole idea of a guardian and buying property and you inherit the wife when you buy the property. I mean, you're probably thinking, that's really weird. But I want you to know something. What was happening there in that text was very cultural. That was the way that their culture operated. I mean, the promised land was set up in such a way that each family had their own designated piece of land. And so if the heir died, then it would fall to the closest relative to redeem that loss. So Boaz, what he decides to do is he's going to take responsibility for Ruth, even though she is a Moabite, even though she's a woman from another country, from an enemy country, he decides to take responsibility for her. And it turns out there's something else here you might not have caught. Did you know that the mother of Boaz, the Bible tells us, is Rahab? Did you know that? You remember Rahab? You remember her? Rahab was the woman who was a spy, in essence, for the Israelites in Jericho. She gave information to the Israelites. She stayed in the camp of Israel, became an Israelite, in essence, followed God, loved God, and she gave birth to a son, and her son's name was Boaz. Pretty cool, huh? So here's Boaz, her son, the son of this woman who had been a prostitute, and yet Boaz honored God, and he brings this woman in. And then here's one more thing you need to see. That God redeems the story with this very unpredictable ending. I mean, when you look here, if you look at Ruth, the story here ends with genealogy. Now, a lot of people get kind of bored with genealogy, right? If you go to Matthew chapter 1, there's all these names all the way down through there, all right? Well, Ruth kind of ends up the same way, all right? It's a story of genealogy. And it's strange until you see these names, because it tells us, like I just read, that Ruth gave birth to Obed, which has a son named Jesse, who had a son named David, which we will soon learn about. And then when you go to Matthew chapter 1, what do we realize? Is that the names that are contained in there almost word for word are once again repeated there in Matthew. And who is the ultimate name that comes up? Jesus. Jesus. So you see here, God is writing His story. He brings Boaz to redeem this life of Ruth and Naomi. And in the process, He's got the upper story in mind, which is resulting in Jesus. Who would have guessed, right? Who would have guessed that God was taking all of these broken pieces of Naomi's life, all of these hurts, all of these pains, and He was writing an incredibly beautiful story. That's what He was doing. Remember when I started out my message here today, I said that I saw this video of this boy who opened the gift, and on the box it had a pottery wheel, and he kind of threw a fit and threw it across the room and got all upset and stormed out, you know. Well, there's more to that video, because see, what happens is his mom goes and picks up the box. So when you're watching the video, his mom goes and picks up the box. She sets it back on a table, like a coffee table. She goes and gets her son and makes him come in and sit down and open the box. Okay? So he opens the box. You know, of course, he's all mad about it. He opens the box, and inside the box is an Xbox with game controllers. And of course, his anger turns to happiness. And she tells him, the only reason I put this game console in this box was because it was the only box I could find to fit everything. And so she had stuck it in the box. Why am I telling you this? Why am I keep repeating this story? You know what? Don't leave the room angry by looking at your box that is your life and looking at the cover of it and not liking it and storming out. I want to encourage you to see what God has inside it. You know, if I look at Naomi's life, if I look at it from the surface, if I look at it as just this box, I would see that her story, I would say that her story was about loss. But the more that God wrote the story, and when we open the box of her life, we see redemption. And it might just be that this box of your life is the only one that God could fit some of these things into. Some of the things that you're going through in your life. You know what's great? You know what's so great about the book of Ruth is that there's no great miracle in the book. When you read through it, there's no, water turning to wine or things like that. No Red Sea parting. It just simply shows that God is at work. And really, that is the message of the story that we're reading through, is that God is at work. You know, it may feel late in your life. You might think that things aren't going so well, that things are too broken. I just want you to know today, I want you to know that God is at work. You know, it might not be obvious and it might not be apparent, but God is at work in your life. It may not be dramatic. It may not be immediate, but God is at work. You know, right now, your box, when you look at it, it might be labeled divorce. It might be labeled widow. It might be labeled cancer, fired, infertile, or abused. That might be what your box looks like right now. But I'm challenging you today. Don't let that be your story. Don't let that be your story. You know what? Your story, it doesn't have to be about loss. It doesn't. Your story can be about redemption. That's what Naomi's story is. And that's the story that's available to you. And you might be thinking, well, how do I know that? It's because I know Jesus. Jesus is our redemption. He is the one who has come and given himself on the cross to save us from our sins. And so today, here in the next few moments, we're going to sing a song of invitation. And if you're looking for that redemption in your life, maybe you feel like you're too far away. You know what? You can never be too far away from the love and the redemption of Jesus Christ. That's a fact.